I appreciate all of your patience, just so that we could get ourselves sorted. I am Rick Davis. I am the founder of Answer Cancer Foundation, but I'm certainly not the only reason we are here. We have some really capable guys who moderate a bunch of different calls, not to mention Renata Lowers, who moderates our caregiver call. And what we do generally, in addition to providing one-on-one navigation and advocacy, is that we run virtual calls. We don't usually have 100 people or more on a call. Our groups are somewhat smaller, vary between as few as 5 people up to about 20 to 30 people. And we run these calls. We are currently running 10 calls a month, mostly prostate cancer, but not only prostate cancer. And if anybody has an interest in running a call themselves or moderating a call for a particular disease or condition, please reach out to me. We're very eager to start calls for breast cancer, colon cancer, lung cancer, for Parkinson's, and other mobility diseases. Greta and I go back quite a long ways. When I first got diagnosed with my own disease in 2007, one of the first people that I stopped by to visit was Greta, and it was because of Greta that it dawned on me that we should be doing the same exercises we do for diet, and UCSF now has a very successful counseling program, which is really modeled on the wonderful diet and nutrition counseling that is offered to every patient who is at UCSF Comprehensive Cancer Center. So I'm pretty familiar with Greta's presentations. They are just excellent. We provided the presentation for everybody who is calling in and cannot see the screen. The link was in the information we sent out. Just for good order's sake, I'll give it to you again. It is, just bear with me. It is ANCAN, that's A in Alpha, N is in Nancy, C is in Charlie, A is in Alpha, N is in Nancy, ancan.org/prostate-cancer. Yeah, I think most of you know how to spell prostate cancer on here. So if you go to our website and you want to follow along yourself at home on the slides, because you've called in and you cannot see what's going on online, it's easy to do that, and we are well aware that there will be a lot of you doing so, and we will try to keep you abreast of what slides we're on. We don't have numbers on the slides, but Greta will do a great job just letting you know where we are. The one thing I just wanted to mention before we start, because I was asked to do so, is just to give a plug to the PCRI conference coming up in Los Angeles. For those of you who have attended, I think you'll all agree it's pretty worthwhile. It's appropriate for all men and their partners and caregivers with prostate cancer, no matter what the level, from active surveillance all the way through to end-stage disease. There are going to be some excellent speakers there this year. From memory, Jonathan Epstein is going to be there. Moyad is always the master of ceremonies. I think Snuffy Myers is going to be there again. Of course, Dr. Schultz, Mark Schultz, and a number of really good people. I will actually be presenting on how to use the internet for prostate cancer. I think the title of the lecture is Internet Resources, but I think the highlight of the whole conference is going to be our chair, John Teisberg, who will be demonstrating his man-junk contraption. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the man-junk animation, it's an excellent animation he did of man-junk. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it referenced on our site. It's like one of the old Monty Python cartoons. and he's actually built a working model of this, and we're shipping it out, and he's going to be demonstrating it 2 or 3 times a day. It should be a lot of fun, especially if we could get Moyad to join in the demonstration. The last thing I just wanted to say is, as far as questions are concerned today, all the questions I've received, I forwarded on. Greta, there are a couple of questions that are in the chat window, so you'll be able to scroll down and see. I think some of them have already been covered in the list. If not, you'll notice that there are a few questions in the chat window. If any of you have questions during the call, please email them to me at info@ancan.org, info@ancan.org, and I will make sure they get passed on to Greta. Or if you are on GoToMeeting, you can put them straight into the chat window. I don't think how many people we're going to be able to have any direct dialogue. I apologize for that, but I'm sure you can all understand. It's just a little difficult with, I mean, we already have about 100 people on the call, and people are coming in as we speak. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Greta. Greta will talk for somewhere between 45 and 60 minutes. It'll go flash, I can guarantee that. It'll be interesting. It'll be a lot of fun. And when we're done, we have a couple of other good things in store for you for the last half hour. So Greta, it's all yours.
Yeah. So can you hear me, Rick?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hear me great? Okay, great. So my name's Greta McCare, and I'm an oncology dietitian nutritionist at UCSF, as Rick said. And I've been working here for over 10 years, working with all types of cancer diagnosis, and specifically have an interest in working with men with prostate cancer. So what I want to do is tonight kind of give you an overview on what my research and all the research that I've looked at is kind of some very important things for your overall health and nutrition. And then, you know, at the end, dive into the questions that you have if I haven't covered them already. So I'm going to move on to the first slide, the next slide. I need my presentation to, okay, here we go. So just kind of wanted to give an overview. I think as time goes on, we all are getting to recognize the importance of nutrition and how we know that a healthy diet reduces the risk of pretty much every chronic disease that ails, you know, the modern man. And typically the Western diet seems to increase the risk of all these chronic diseases. So things like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and cancer. And, you know, if this was 30 years ago, we probably wouldn't really be talking about this connection, but it's pretty well established at this point. It's estimated that about 30% of cancer deaths in the United States can be attributed to diet in adulthood, and that's including the effects of obesity on cancer-related deaths. So that's equivalent to what we see as far as how smoking affects cancer death risk in the United States. So pretty significant effect. As far as looking a little bit more at prostate cancer, there's really much more growing scientific evidence that diet and lifestyle practices may slow the growth and progression of prostate cancer. And this statement was put out by the Prostate Cancer Foundation in one of their publications in 2015. And I'd say the body of evidence is growing as we have more time to study men post-diagnosis and look at what really impacts outcomes, progression, and recurrence of prostate cancer. And so I want to highlight what the studies have found to date. And a lot of the guidelines that I'm talking about follow the guidelines that the American Institute for Cancer Research, the website is aicr.org. They have about 8 guidelines for cancer survivors that are associated with better overall health and lower risk of cancer and mortality. And so a lot of these guidelines kind of cross along different types of cancer: prostate cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer. So going on to slide 4, the sort of #1 recommendation that I can make is to think about choosing mostly plant foods for the base of your diet as far as a cancer risk reduction strategy. We know that high intake of plant foods, things like vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, some fruit, basically our plant-based foods, are kind of the cornerstone of a healthy diet. And it's really a twofold benefit. One, there's higher amounts of cancer protective substances. So those are things like vitamins, minerals, fiber, prebiotics, which are really important food for the gut bacteria that are a really important part of our immune system. And we get these compounds called phytonutrients, which I'll talk a little bit more about from plant-based foods. At the same time, when people are eating more plant-based foods, and I like the way this plate is set up because you really see when I'm talking about a plant-based diet, that doesn't mean eating, bread and tortilla chips. It's really looking at, are you eating a lot of, half your plate being vegetables, getting plant-based fats? That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about a plant-based diet, not just a vegetarian diet. Still, some animal foods can still be consumed on a plant-based diet, but make up a much smaller portion of total food. And the end result is less total calories, typically, less intake of animal fats and animal proteins, both which have been correlated with prostate cancer progression. Processed foods, added sugars, they all tend to be lower on a plant-based diet. So I wanted to just touch a little bit more on this concept of phytonutrients. And so the next slide is this very colorful slide that has sort of all of this wheel of different colored vegetables and fruits. It has green tea, and then it has herbs and spices on it. And what phytonutrients are is they're plant compounds that they give plants their colors, and they protect the plant from the environment. So they're like the natural herbicides in plants or the insecticides, the natural sunscreens that plants have so that they can thrive in there and grow. And when we eat these colorful compounds, they actually have a lot of health benefits, a lot of anti-cancer actions in our body. So things that provide color to the plants can act as anti-inflammatory compounds, and we know that chronic inflammation can promote cancer. So when you hear about things like turmeric or berries, sort of the dark, deep colored spices, cayenne pepper, those are all anti-inflammatory. We also have phytonutrients that help our livers to detoxify compounds that can become carcinogens in our body and promote cancer cell development. A lot of these compounds help cause cancer cell suicide, which is a great thing. We want that to happen. And so we get all of these compounds from colorful fruits and vegetables. I'm going to touch on a few that have been really emerged in the science of prostate cancer as probably having some really specific benefits for prostate cancer. But the idea is really thinking about trying to eat the rainbow every day. And this is just a handout that I have that comes from an organization that encourages people to eat the nutrition rainbow to really obtain the benefit of all of the anti-cancer compounds that we can get from the red, orange, yellow, green, going down the line. Because all of these compounds have synergistic actions, meaning, they help amplify the benefits of some of other compounds in the food. And they also have overlapping and then independent action. So my one goal is to think about eating 4 or more colors a day. And so that might be green leafy vegetables, that might be onions and garlic, which are the allium vegetables. That could be something orange like a carrot to get some beta carotene. But really, the more colors you can introduce in, the more of the array of these phytonutrients or phytochemicals, you'll hear them called as well. And even things like tea. So green tea has been looked at, as well as coffee, for having some anti-prostate cancer effects. And we really attribute that to these phytonutrients or phytochemicals. So I wanted to highlight, we've done some studies here at UCSF looking at different vegetables that men with prostate cancer eat, and compared those that eat a lot of them versus those that don't eat many of them, and found, some things have emerged as far as progression, more progression or less progression of prostate cancer. And so the first family I wanted to highlight are what we call the cruciferous vegetables. So the cruciferous vegetables are, and everything on this list, you'll see Brussels sprouts, garden cress, mustard greens, down the list, cabbage, kale, broccoli, bok choy. So these are all what we call the cruciferous vegetables, and they have similar compounds in them that are called glucosinolates. And these glucosinolates help to detoxify carcinogens. They can stop cancer cells from growing and dividing, and then they can promote that cancer cell suicide. And so some research led us to think that these had specific anti-prostate cancer actions. And so a study was done looking at cruciferous vegetable consumption and found that men that had the highest intake, which was about half a cup or more of a cruciferous vegetable serving daily, compared to those that had the lowest intake, which was about 1 serving a week, had almost 60% lower risk of prostate cancer progression when they compared the two groups. So that seems like a sort of easy thing to think about incorporating in about a half a cup or more of one of these cruciferous vegetables. With cruciferous vegetables, you lose a lot of the nutrients if you overcook them. It's doing some light steaming or sauteing is fine, but keeping them crunchy and crisp and bright in color will really indicate that you're retaining a lot of those glucosinolates, or eating them raw as well. The next vegetable, which is actually a fruit, but we always think, I don't know, people always call it a vegetable, but are foods that are rich in something called lycopene. And lycopene is one of those phytonutrients, and some studies have shown that it can inhibit prostate cancer growth and spread, or what we call metastasis. And when you eat cooked tomatoes, you actually can absorb the lycopene much easier than if you're eating a raw tomato. Also, when you eat tomatoes with oil, or cooked tomatoes with oil, so the idea of like marinara sauce with olive oil, the oil increases the absorption of the lycopene as well. And another study that we did looking at men's consumption of cooked tomato products found that having 2 or more servings a week versus 1 serving or less a month, that the men that ate 2 servings or more a week had about a 66% lower rate of metastatic prostate cancer. So that's something that I always kind of encourage, is to get at least a half a cup or more of cooked tomatoes twice a week, at least twice a week, and having it at the same time that there's a little bit of olive oil or nuts, something to help with the absorption. And you can see that something like tomato juice, tomato paste, spaghetti sauce, they're going to have quite a bit more lycopene than, say, a raw tomato. And it's just basically because that raw tomato it's much harder to absorb the lycopene. So a common question that I get asked is about organic vegetables and fruits. What's the advantage? Is it important to get organic vegetables and fruits as far as cancer risk? And there's really no clear-cut answer to that. In general, it would be really hard to link eating organic vegetables and fruits with a lower or higher risk of cancer. Although, if you look at some of the president's cancer panel back from several years ago, they did recommend that in general to reduce cancer risk, it's a good idea to choose as much organic as possible, just to decrease the load of pesticides and residues that the body has to process and detoxify. One way to think about it is when you're eating organic vegetables and fruits, they tend to have a higher level of those phytonutrients because they have to protect themselves more from the environment. They're not protected by the sprays. And so you may be getting, a little bit of a nutritional advantage from the phytonutrient content. The vitamins and minerals, we don't see a huge increase, but those phytonutrients are probably higher. So as much as you can, I would choose organic vegetables and fruits, but I really go for the dirty dozen. So you'll see this slide says, what about organics? And then it says EWG dirty 12. And so the dirty 12 are listed there. It's, strawberry, spinach, down the line. And it's estimated that you can reduce your pesticide exposure from vegetables and fruits by buying these 12 organic by 90%. So these are the ones where it's probably going to make a significant difference as far as your overall pesticide intake. And so I recommend, getting these ones organic, and the rest is sort of what's available, what's affordable. And overall, the bottom line is that eating vegetables, eating more plant-based foods is beneficial regardless of whether they're organic or not. So I wouldn't let that stop you from eating vegetables if you can't get organic, but just for these 12, I would try to spend a little extra money or eat them when they're in season so that you can get them organic and affordable. So moving on to the next aspect of a plant-based diet that I wanted to highlight is that more plant-based foods equals higher fiber intake. Fiber is all the undigestible parts of your vegetables, of your nuts, seeds, your beans. If you're eating, when you eat grains, if it's a whole grain, there's going to be more dietary fiber. Beans, legumes, there's quite a bit of fiber. And we know that fiber helps to bind to toxins that we come in contact with or we eat, and helps us eliminate them more regularly in our stools, so that decreases the body burden. It helps maintain healthy cholesterol levels. It helps with blood sugar management. Fiber is really the best food for your gut bacteria. And again, we're learning more and more about how important that health of our gut microbiome is. And so fiber is what we call the prebiotics, the food to keep our bacteria healthy. We have way more bacterial cells in our body than human cells. So we want to keep those bacteria healthy and thriving and diverse, because that's been linked with a lot more kind of overall healthy pictures in terms of weight management. Everything from mood to diabetes to heart disease and cancer are being linked to our gut bacteria. So what's a recommended amount of fiber? So for men, the recommendation for fiber is somewhere between 25 and 40 grams per day. And so men are going to typically need more calories and typically going to be on the higher end, so somewhere between 30 to 40 grams of fiber per day. This slide, it's the green slide that has serving sizes and the sort of estimated amount of fiber that you get per serving, is just there to give you an idea of where you'd be getting fiber in the day. And so what I find is that the goal overall is to be eating at least 5 servings of vegetables a day, and a serving is about a half a cup to a cup depending on the vegetable. And so you can see here, if somebody's eating 5 servings of vegetables, they're probably already getting 20 grams of fiber right there. A serving of beans or lentils is going to be, half a cup is going to be, 8 grams of fiber. And any fruit or whole grain would be, again, a great source of fiber. So ideally looking at making sure that you're having fiber at each meal so that you're not trying to eat it all at once, which can lead to a lot of gas, bloating, just overall discomfort in your digestive tract. But that fiber helps really maintain healthy blood sugar levels, as well as, weight management and cholesterol. So when I talk about eating more low glycemic foods, which I'll mention in a few slides. Fiber is one of the components of the diet that helps our blood sugar stay more stable when we're eating and avoid these spikes and drops in our blood sugar, which we know are really not good for us overall. So this is just an easy slide. A lot of people that I talk to, if they're really kind of on top of their diet already, are doing way more than this. But for people that haven't really paid attention to fiber, just some simple things to think about would be that fresh fruit has fiber, juice does not. So I don't recommend drinking any fruit juice. Whole grains can have some fiber, and a slice of bread should have at least 3 grams of fiber per serving. If you're eating rice, brown rice, or something like quinoa or barley would have fiber, whereas white rice, white pasta, there's not going to be any fiber there. And beans will have fiber, so substituting in some beans for meat or beans for rice would give you a lot more fiber. And even just aiming to get an extra serving of a non-starchy vegetable at a meal could give you a few extra grams of fiber. So again, the goal is to get somewhere between 30 and 40 grams a day and probably about 10 grams per meal, so to space that out. I did want to touch on whole grains because this is a question that comes up a lot, and a lot of people that I talk to feel like they know what whole grains are, and they, it's not really something that they feel like they need to revisit. But I just wanted to point out that a whole grain is actually the grain as it comes out of the ground. Examples of whole grains are listed there. So we've got the actual picture of the grain, and you'll see that when you're getting a whole grain, you're getting all of the nutrients that come along with that grain. So the vitamins, the fiber, the trace minerals, the phytochemicals or phytonutrients. And so when you eat the grain as it comes out of the ground, you're really getting the most, and it's going to take the longest for your body to break that down. Whereas if you were to, say, refine that even into wheat flour, as opposed to eating wheat berries, which are the actual grain, the minute you start refining these grains, you start losing the nutrition and you start increasing just the starchy component without fibers and the proteins to kind of balance out the effects of the carbohydrate on your blood sugar. So my kind of guideline or recommendation is to try to include in if you are eating grains or whatever grains you're eating, to try to include as many of the actual grains as possible over a bread or a cracker or anything processed, and to diversify your grains. So the more variety you're eating, so if it's oats and quinoa and buckwheat, you're getting a lot more nutrition than, say, just eating brown rice as your only grain, because a lot of the nutrients are going to be different from grain to grain. Even with good quality whole grains, I would go back to that first slide with the plate, and you'll see when you look back at that slide that only a quarter of the plate is grains. So even on a plant-based diet, unless somebody's really high energy and they're burning a lot of calories through exercise, then they may need some more carbohydrates for energy. But for most people, kind of thinking about a quarter of the plate or a quarter of their diet, being from some kind of whole grain or starchy vegetable is adequate, and doesn't need to be a high grain diet, basically, to get those nutrients. And so when they say 3 servings of whole grains a day is recommended, they're literally talking about 3 half-cup cooked servings of grain. So that's a half a cup of cooked oatmeal, a half a cup of cooked quinoa, and then maybe like a half a cup of wild rice or something at dinner. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a high grain diet in order to get some benefits from whole grains. If you're buying products in the store, one thing I would look at is first all the ingredients, and make sure that the first ingredient says either whole or sprouted. That's your first tip that you're eating a whole grain. If you see the word enriched or just wheat, like wheat flour, it's actually not a whole grain. There might be a whole grain way down the list, ingredient 5 or 6, but it's actually not going to be considered a whole grain product. And when you look at the nutrition facts, for each 10 grams of carbohydrate, there should be at least 1 gram of fiber. So it's like a 10-to-1 ratio of carbohydrates to fiber. So on this label where it says the nutrition facts, it says the 10-to-1 rule for choosing whole grain. I have a circle around the total carbohydrates, 23 grams, and then the dietary fiber is 5. So this product exceeds the 10-to-1 rule. So this would be a decent whole grain product, whether it's a cereal or a bread or something like that. The other thing that to be cautious with if you are eating any kind of like cold cereals and such is that there can be a lot of added sugar even when it's a high fiber cereal. So I always look at the sugars as well, and the ideal cereal is 0, but if it's 5 grams or less, it would still be considered a fairly low amount of added sugar in a cold cereal. And then that brings me to my next recommendation, which is to limit the added sugars in refined grains. So besides being low in nutrient value, the more, like I said before, the more you process those grains or add sugar to foods, the nutritional value starts going down. So we're really not kind of optimizing our nutrient intake and giving our body sort of the best fuel. But you're also going to see a higher glycemic load. And so there's this little diagram at the bottom. And when something is considered a high glycemic load food, you're going to get the red line where you see this spike in blood sugar level, and then that means a surge in your insulin because your body always wants to keep your blood sugar level stable, and you get what's called the blood sugar roller coaster, as opposed to eating foods that are in their natural packages like vegetables and fruits. You get more of a slow and steady rise and fall in your blood sugar. That blood sugar roller coaster has been shown to have negative effects on your immune system. Obviously, it's not going to be helpful for mood, energy, just overall focus when we're having blood sugar highs and lows. And then a concerning thing, especially for men with prostate cancer, is that these highly processed foods or foods with added sugar are going to tend to promote weight gain, especially fat storage around the abdominal region. And we know that that can cause more increase in inflammation. It can increase something called IGF-1, which a lot of you are familiar with, which is a growth promoter of cells, and a lot of cancer cells have receptors for insulin and IGF-1. So the more we can stay off the blood sugar roller coaster, the better in terms of our overall health and the cancer piece as well. So this is a problem because the current U.S. daily intake of added sugar is 22 teaspoons of sugar, so that's 355 calories of added sugar that on average Americans are eating. And really the guidelines, there are no set guidelines as far as cancer risk reduction or cancer progression goes. But the American Heart Association guidelines recommend that the upper limit of added sugar for men be 150 calories a day. That doesn't mean I'm saying consume that much a day. That's the upper limit. So less is better as far as added sugar goes all the way around. But you can see that as a whole, we're eating, double that much. And I really feel like that 150 calories, which translates out to like 9 teaspoons of added sugar, is already kind of pushing the limit. So we have a sweet tooth that we need to tame. And so where are people getting, let me go through this. Yes, it's 9 teaspoons for males, 5 teaspoons for females as far as added sugar limits. So a lot of times, the next slide says, where's the added sugar? And a lot of times people are doing a really great job, avoiding the candy, and, they've stopped putting sugar in their coffee and all those things. But they're not necessarily realizing that the foods that they buy could be loaded with sugar. So, everything from yogurt that's fruit flavored has sugar. Bottled salad dressing can have a lot of added sugar. This one has, going on 2 teaspoons of added sugar. Some energy bars are just notorious for having, you know, brown rice syrup as their first ingredient. So they're going to be very high in added sugar. And then even some sauces, so things like teriyaki sauce, barbecue sauce, there can be a lot of added sugar. So in this day, even though, you know, the person hasn't really sat down to a piece of chocolate cake or anything, they have had, you know, 53 grams of added sugar just from sauces and things like that. So I think it's really helpful to just be aware of all the various names for added sugar in processed food. Now, if you shop at the farmer's market and you shop at the perimeter, around the perimeter of the store, and you don't buy processed foods, it's going to make life a lot easier for you. But practically speaking, you know, a lot of people do still rely on some convenience items. And kind of just getting familiar with all these different words. A lot of them sound fairly healthy. You know, brown rice syrup sounds pretty healthy, nectars, you know, evaporated cane juice, but these are all equal sugar. So I just would recommend, you know, keeping that in mind as far as when you see it listed first, second, third on the ingredient list, is probably making up a pretty high amount of the calories in that food are coming from added sugars. So I just want to go back to this concept of eating a more low glycemic load diet. And again, with that plate that I showed in the first slide, that would be a good picture of what a low glycemic load diet would look like. The first thing is, the more real whole foods you eat, the more low glycemic load. Because sometimes it's just good to keep things simple and not feel like you have to get too bogged down with the details. So if you're eating whole, real foods, there's a lot less worry about high glycemic or raising your blood sugar or causing weight gain. Another tip is to avoid eating naked carbs. So naked carbs would be eating, you know, pretzels for a snack. Even having fruit by itself isn't really ideal. So I recommend trying to combine any carbohydrate-rich foods that you eat with protein and or healthy fats at the same time. So if you have a piece of fruit, having it with nuts is a great way to kind of balance that out. If you have a slice of whole grain bread, putting some almond butter on it, or even some avocado or something like that, again, to kind of even it out so that your blood sugar doesn't react as much to that carbohydrate. Natural packaged foods, you know, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, again, the real whole foods. If you're minimizing processed foods, that's going to be an easy way to get lower glycemic load diet. And sugary beverages have the greatest impact on blood sugar. So that would be sort of a #1 thing, is to avoid sugary beverages. That includes fruit juice, any kind of juice drinks, sweetened teas, coffees, etc. And so that's one easy way to think about it, about lowering the glycemic load of your diet. And what that translates into is, you know, kind of better blood sugar control, which means less insulin spikes, less IGF-1, which has been linked with cancer risk, and better able to control your weight. So next, moving on to meat and cancer and kind of how strong is the evidence here. So with processed meats, or meats that have been preserved, smoked, salted, cured, that have added nitrates or preservatives. So these are things like salami, bacon, some sausages, hot dogs, and these foods have sort of group 1 classification in terms of with cancer risk. So the recommendation is to just completely avoid any kind of processed meats altogether. Somebody had a question about fresh sausage, and so fresh sausage that's not preserved would fall more into the red meat category. So that would be one. Red meat, which is considered pork, beef, and lamb, has more of a 2A classification in terms of cancer risk, and so there's not a guideline that says you have to completely avoid it. It's just more recommended to limit it. And why does red meat increase the risk of cancer when a lot of it or highly consumed? We don't exactly know, but there's a lot of things that are being looked at as far as the protein, the animal fat, When it's charred or cooked at high temperatures, that increases something called genotoxins. High protein diets are linked with an increase in that compound IGF-1 that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of the commercially raised meats, are going to have potentially added growth hormones or antibiotics. So, if you do have some modest intake of red meat, I think the safest bet would be to try to go with a grass-fed or a game meat, because not only is it going to be leaner, but it's also going to have healthier types of fats and it won't have growth hormones or antibiotics. So I think that would be a better choice for some red meat. And so as far as red meat and prostate cancer goes, there's a study that found a non-significant increase in prostate cancer progression in men already diagnosed with prostate cancer, with about a 45% increase linked with advanced or fatal prostate cancer in men that were consuming processed meat regularly. So then to move on to talk about fats in the diet. So there's quite a bit of evidence that says that fat is can be very beneficial for men with prostate cancer, depending on the type of fat that's consumed. And so this slide says healthy fats, and there's pictures of mostly plant foods, and then there's some salmon in the middle. And basically the healthiest fats that we found that seem to offer some protection in terms of prostate cancer are high omega-3 foods, which omega-3s are essential fatty acids. So they're found in cold water fatty fish. Listed here we have salmon, sardines, black cod, trout, herring. And the recommendation is to include those fish twice a week or more. You get some omega-3s from plants like ground flax seeds, walnuts, pumpkin seeds, chia seeds. And then also our monounsaturated fatty acids, or omega-9 rich foods. And you'll find those in olive oil, olives, almonds, avocado, canola oil. I would go organic canola oil for that one, but and then macadamia nut oil is also high in monounsaturated fats. And there's two interesting studies that I wanted to just mention that examined the intake of types of fat in men with prostate cancer. And this looked at all-cause mortality and prostate cancer-specific mortality. The first one is called the Health Professional Follow-Up Study, and it was published in 2013. And so this is a prospective study, and it found that replacing 10% of daily energy intake or calorie intake from carbohydrates with vegetable fats was linked to a 30% lower risk of lethal prostate cancer and about a 25% lower risk of all-cause mortality. But they found in that same study that men when replacing 5% of daily energy from carbohydrates with animal fat, all-cause mortality went up by 30%. So in this study, we really found that vegetable fats had a protective effect, whereas animal fats didn't so much. Were considered, promoters or linked with all-cause mortality. The second study is the Physicians' Health Study, and this found similar results. They found that replacing 5% or more of calories with animal fat versus carbohydrates. So these people had a little less carb intake and higher animal fat. That was linked with like a 280% higher risk of prostate cancer mortality and an 80% higher risk of all-cause mortality. So again, the animal fats didn't seem to offer any benefit, even though they were cutting back on the carbohydrates a little bit. So the vegetable fats seem to be the best in terms of increasing the benefits of fat. So now we really encourage men to have at least one serving of vegetable fat a day, like a tablespoon of olive oil, a serving of nuts, something like that, to get those benefits. I also wanted to mention, the next slide says balance your essential fatty acids. And so essential fatty acids are fats that we need to get from our diet. We can't make them from other foods we eat, like we can make a lot of other nutrients. And what we found is that the standard American diet, which we call SAD, or the Western diet, contains far more omega-6 than omega-3 fats. So these are the two essential fats, omega-6 and omega-3. So we need both of them, but the imbalance that we see with the Western diet that's much higher in omega-6 has negative effects on various aspects of our health. And so you see with the omega-6 fats, which are in red, the primary sources that are in the Western diet and so abundant are grain-fed meats, dairy fats, egg yolks, certain vegetable oils that are really common in restaurant eating and processed foods. These are pro-inflammatory. So studies have shown that they promote inflammation, they promote tumor growth, progression, and angiogenesis, which is blood supply going from one cell, a cancerous cell, to a healthy cell, and kind of then progressing a cancer cell. And they also suppress immune function. Whereas the omega-3s, which our diet tends to be low in, again, come from those cold water fish, the flax seeds, chia seeds, walnut seeds, and pumpkin seeds, have more of an anti-inflammatory effect. And they've been shown to inhibit tumor growth and that angiogenesis, and then also be immune enhancing. And so they have done some studies looking at men's fish consumption in relation to prostate cancer disease progression, and found a correlation between men that eat at least 2 servings of fish per week being associated with a lower risk of progressive prostate cancer and metastasis, or prostate cancer spread. I do want to just mention that I'm talking about fish and eating it twice a week. I wouldn't recommend eating a lot of the really large predatory fish, so things like swordfish, shark, ahi, tuna, on a really regular basis, like several times a week, just because they have a lot more mercury. So that's going to be, a negative in terms of those fish. But the cold water fish are a great source of omega-3 fatty acids and tend to be low in mercury, especially the little ones like sardines and herring. So those are really a good way to get omega-3s. I think somebody had a question about shrimp, and so seafood like shrimp, crab, they don't have a lot of the omega-3 fatty acids, so they won't really be something that would supply a good source of omega-3 fatty acids. I wouldn't count those towards the 2 times a week of eating fish. I just wanted to compare 2 meals, and again, breakfast number 1 and number 2 are not necessarily either of them the optimal breakfast, but because I pointed out the studies where animal fat seemed to be linked with increase in overall death in men with prostate cancer, I just wanted to point out 2 breakfasts and how they could be really vastly different in animal fat, and that I have that called saturated fat because most of the animal fat is saturated fat. And you'll see breakfast number 1 is sort of what you would get at the local coffee shop, and that's like a coffee cake, a low-fat mocha with whipped cream, and some fruit. And this has about 21 grams of saturated fat, so that's going to be more than what would be recommended in a day, as opposed to breakfast number 2, which is more food actually, but it's whole grain bread with hummus and tomatoes and fruit, and still coffee, but made with soy milk, is going to be much, much lower in overall calories, and also much lower in animal fat, and replacing some of that animal fat with vegetable fat, because the hummus would be made with olive oil, and then the soy milk, if it's regular soy milk, would have a couple grams of fat. So that would be a way to increase vegetable fat over animal fat. Okay, so then this just talks about, this is actually probably something we don't have to worry about for too much longer, this is what we call the partially hydrogenated oils or the trans fats. And I just wanted to point this out because numerous studies have linked them with increased risk for heart disease, but also some studies have found that men that consume a lot of partially hydrogenated oils, actually that was linked with prostate cancer. And so the main thing is, if you do buy processed foods, to look at the ingredient list and avoid anything that has the word partially hydrogenated. It's actually pretty difficult to find foods with partially hydrogenated oil, but what was I looking at lately? Oh, I recently saw a bar, like a protein bar at a gym that I went to that, and I think a lot of people, kind of gravitate towards those quick protein bars, and it had a few grams of trans fat. I was pretty shocked because they're not very easy to find. So it's just find them in frozen foods, baked goods, that kind of thing. So just to talk about a few other animal foods of concern and things that you may have read about or heard about or had questions about. The first one being chicken, and you'll see in the picture, you see barbecued chicken with the skin on it. And so studies have found more of an increased risk of progression linked with chicken if it's got the skin on it or if it's been fried or barbecued. So we have seen that correlation in a couple of studies. If you look at the studies with skinless poultry, it actually is pretty much neutral in regards to prostate cancer, where you don't really see much of an increase or really any increase in risk. And there was another study that found that substituting poultry or fish in place of red meat was associated with a lower risk of recurrence in one study. And so for every ounce of chicken or fish that a man ate compared to red meat, it was associated with lower risk of prostate cancer recurrence. So if you're eating chicken, I would recommend, pretty much skinless, chicken or turkey, pretty much skinless, lean, lean cuts, and not barbecued at high temperatures. The second group is we have milk up there, we have dairy products, and so there's milk, there's cheese, butter. So we definitely see a correlation between dairy intake and high dairy intake over the lifetime and a higher risk of developing prostate cancer. There's less data on after diagnosis, but there was a recent study that was published in 2015 that found men that were having 3 or more servings of dairy per day. So a serving is about 8 ounces of milk, 1 ounce of cheese, which is like a slice of cheese. 3 servings or more a day had about a 75% higher overall mortality and about 141% prostate cancer specific mortality versus the men that had less than 1 serving of dairy products per day. It's a little stronger for full fat dairy products, but the relationship still exists when you look at heavy consumption of even non-fat or low fat dairy products. So I encourage men to find substitutes for dairy products, trying things like soy milk, almond milk, using, and again, substituting an animal fat like cheese with something like avocado or hummus on a sandwich or something is a good way to get more vegetable fat and less animal fat. And the last food there is, you'll see this egg, and I put the egg up there because eggs are the highest source of choline in the diet, and choline is a nutrient that's very important for growth and development. So babies need a really high amount of choline in their diet as they're growing. But we've also seen that choline is one nutrient that prostate cancer cells seem to use as a fuel source. And so studies started looking at choline intake and prostate cancer, and it's not conclusive, but there was a study looking at egg consumption and found that men that have 2.5 whole eggs per week compared to those that have less than 1 whole egg a week have about an 80% higher risk of developing lethal prostate cancer. and they found the same when they looked at overall choline intake, because we get choline from other foods too, but egg yolks are really like the highest dietary source of choline. But that study found that heavy intake of choline versus lowest intake of choline had about a 70% higher risk of lethal prostate cancer in the highest group versus the lowest group. So I recommend limiting whole eggs because the yolk is where the choline is found. And egg whites would be a good substitute for that, or using soy. And I know, sometimes people wonder, is soy okay for prostate cancer because of the phytoestrogen? And most of the studies show that it's either neutral, has no effect in terms of increasing or decreasing prostate cancer risk, or it may have even a protective effect, where some studies show that there are some beneficial compounds in soy that can have an anti-prostate cancer effect. And so maybe substituting in like a tofu scramble for eggs, something like that. And so then I always get the question, what about alcohol and caffeine? And so the good news is that drinking coffee is safe. It may even have some health benefits, some prostate cancer specific health benefits. We're still kind of looking at that, but I'll always recommend to consider what you put in your coffee, because a cup of black coffee is a lot different than, again, a mocha or a coffee with, half and half and a tablespoon of sugar. So we're really talking about black coffee as potentially having benefits. And alcohol in moderation also has not been linked with aggressive prostate cancer. Heavy drinking has, and so there was a study that found that men that consume 3 drinks or more per day on a regular basis have a higher risk of metastatic prostate cancer. But it seems that if it's 2 drinks a day or less, there's not really a correlation. I know this is for men with prostate cancer, but there's probably a lot of women listening in, so I just wanted to point out that women, the recommendation is 1 drink or less per day. And if there's any history of breast cancer, it's even recommended to be more conservative with alcohol, like 2 to 3 drinks a week. And the serving size is really something to think about, because a serving of wine is only 5 ounces. It's not half a bottle. So sometimes, depending on the glass that you drink from, the serving size can be different. 12 ounces of beer or 1.5 ounces of alcohol. And if you're drinking wine, benefits probably are going to be mainly from red wine, because again, it has some phytochemicals, phytonutrients that called resveratrol, which are in the grape skins that get more into the red wine. White wine doesn't have resveratrol, so red wine would be, beer could potentially have some benefits. And then just wanted to touch on supplements. Supplements is such a rich topic that we could talk about it for hours, but there really isn't any strong evidence that any supplements reduce cancer risk. There's a lot of things that are being looked at, but at this point we don't have enough evidence to say a particular supplement is going to reduce cancer risk. Diet is probably much more convincing and more solid. So it's really best to get nutrients from food whenever possible. And sometimes, of concern is when high intake of supplements maybe have been linked with an increase in cancer. So for example, a lot of you are probably familiar with the vitamin E study with the high dose vitamin E that was increased prostate cancer risk. And there's a pretty well-established relationship with high excess calcium intake. And that's like over 2,000 milligrams a day of calcium being linked with a higher risk of prostate cancer. That doesn't mean that I'm saying to not take supplements at all, but more, for other health concerns. Or if they're not harmful, if it's kind of like do no harm and you've figured out that there's not going to be any downside to taking them, it might be okay to have some supplement that you think maybe has some health benefits and there's little downside to that. So one supplement that I pretty much recommend across the board is vitamin D, because it's pretty difficult to get adequate vitamin D from the sun, which is where we get most of our vitamin D, if you're working inside or if you're wearing sunscreen or you're covering up. Food sources are pretty limited. You do get it from fatty fish, fortified foods, so a lot of your non-dairy milks are fortified with vitamin D. But we know it's really important for bone health, especially for men on hormone therapy. There's more research is needed, but there's been lots of links with lower cancer risk, with adequate vitamin D in the blood, and we know it's important for immune system. So it's estimated that about 75% of Americans have low vitamin D levels. A normal level is 30, but I actually recommend that your vitamin D level be over 35. So ideally, we're looking at somewhere between 40 and 60. That's a blood level, nanograms per milliliter of vitamin D, and that's a blood test you can ask your doctor for. It's called the 25-OH or 25-hydroxy vitamin D level, and especially if you're going through hormone therapy because of the bone effects of long-term androgen deprivation therapy. How much do you need? It really depends on your vitamin D level. Adult requirements are set at 600 IUs of vitamin D per day, but most people, if their level is low, they're going to need to take more than that, probably more like 2,000 IUs or so. It just depends on your level and your individual requirements. If you are taking a vitamin D supplement, I would recommend going with vitamin D3 because it's easier to absorb, and vitamin D is fat soluble, so it's a good idea to take it with food because it's easier to absorb. Okay, and then body weight and exercise. So we know that higher body mass and physical inactivity contributes to prostate cancer risk. This is an old study, and there's more and more studies kind of looking at this, but this study found that obese men had a 20% higher risk of dying from prostate cancer, and those that were severely obese had about a 34% elevated risk. And so when they say obese, they were looking at their body mass index, which is really just a screening tool looking at weight for height, but an obese BMI would be over 30. And so that's sort of what they're using as a general screening tool. We also found in a study that we did many years ago that men that maintained a healthy body weight had a lower risk of recurrence. The men in our group that were obese had a 30% higher risk of recurrence, and the very obese had almost 70% higher risk of recurrence. Basically, that body fat is not just, kind of hanging around. It's really metabolically active and driving a lot of those inflammatory compounds and insulin and IGF-1, all those things that we kind of link with cancer progression or promotion. So exercise is really important, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because you probably have had a specialist talk about exercise, but the guideline is to build at least 30 minutes of exercise into your schedule most days. That would be considered cardiovascular exercise or aerobic exercise. American Cancer Society also recommends two sessions of weight training a week and some kind of balance training as well. But we did a couple studies here and found that prostate cancer survivors who performed 3 or more hours per week of vigorous activity had a 60% lower risk of death from prostate cancer compared to those that were getting 1 hour or less of that vigorous activity, or 1 hour a week of activity didn't have to be vigorous. So that vigorous exercise was very beneficial. And then we also did a study that found that men who walked 3 or more hours per week at a brisk pace, which is considered 3 miles per hour or greater, after diagnosis had about a 50% lower risk of prostate cancer recurrence compared to the men who walked less than 3 hours per week at an easy pace, which was less than 2 miles per hour. So exercise and diet are like Siamese twins. You kind of can't have one without the other and get the benefits. So if you are struggling with weight, one thing that I like to promote is eating more and weighing less. And again, that's kind of one of the benefits of eating a plant-based diet. And again, I wouldn't say that, so you've got 2 slides here. It says eat more, weigh less, and it shows you 2 different diets. And it says that each of them are 1,575 calories. Now on the left side, you see a lot of processed foods. So you don't really get to eat that much. You're getting a lot of the white, refined, sugary foods or fried foods. And so you don't get to feel full and satisfied from that 1,600 calories. Whereas if you're going for more plant-based foods, so there's a lot of nice raw vegetables, soups. I don't know what those beverages are. I wouldn't really recommend the juice, but the idea is look how much more food you can eat, 1,600 calories. And, when you're eating a lot less to try to reduce your weight, feeling somewhat satisfied is important. So the more vegetables, the more fiber you're eating, the helpful it is. That's a low energy density diet. And so again, just to kind of revisit that plate, looking at half or more coming from vegetables, a quarter coming from maybe whole grain or starchy vegetable, or you could just do, 3/4 vegetables, and then a third or less animal protein. And so kind of going from that standard Western diet where you see the big piece of meat, the big potatoes with the peas, which is they're actually all starchy vegetables, and moving over to where there's more color on the plate, more fiber, and just a lot more nutrition, a lot less calories. So to summarize and then kind of move on to the questions, what can a healthy diet do for me? A lot of patients say that to me. May help inhibit prostate cancer growth. There's more and more research pointing us in that direction. We know it reduces the risk of other chronic diseases. A lot of times it's hard to measure how your diet is affecting prostate cancer because things like PSA levels and things don't always correlate with diet changes, systematically, but sometimes looking at things like how your cholesterol levels change, how your blood sugar level changes, your triglycerides, things like that can be good markers. We know that a healthy diet enhances the immune system, increases energy level, and if you are going through treatment, tends to decrease the toxicities of the treatment and helps you, recover faster. So my kind of overall prostate cancer diet is to think about including at least a cup or more of vegetables with 2 meals, trying to eat cruciferous vegetables daily, including cooked tomatoes at least twice a week, beans and legumes and whole grains as another way to get fiber and plant-based protein, limit meats, poultry skin, eggs, dairy, and avoid processed meats, limit the processed and refined foods, so avoiding the white, incorporating healthy fats into the diet, so from fish, the plant-based fats, eat at least 1 serving of plant-based fat daily, and include fish twice a week. Green tea, I think, is another way to get more good phytochemicals in your diet, so 1 to 4 cups daily, adequate vitamin D levels, and regular physical activity, and working on a healthy body weight. So this is a sample meal plan. I just put that in there for your reference, just for something to kind of look at what could be considered a healthy meal plan. There's a lot more options, but there's really just a lot of color and some, protein with each meal and plenty of water throughout the day. And I recommend to always discuss changes you're making with your diet and supplements with your healthcare team to make sure it doesn't interact with anything. Sometimes going on a big, change in your diet can affect the way you metabolize certain medicines, things like that. So it's kind of always good to make sure all your bases are covered. And, thinking about trying to go with food first and food being medicine and really being one of the biggest healing components of your lifestyle. So as far as resources go, I just included a few, and I know Rick put some on the website, but I really like Rebecca Katz's cookbooks. The Cancer Fighting Kitchen is really excellent. The Cancer Wellness Cookbook and Eat to Beat Prostate Cancer. I like that cookbook as well. I like the American Institute for Cancer Research website and the ourcancerucsf.edu website that I have listed there. We have a ton of recipes that I've posted. And then for supplements, Consumer Labs is really helpful because they test supplements for purity and potency. They don't test all supplements, so it is a paid service, and then they do test some voluntarily, but you can get a good idea if a supplement is reputable and it's going to, you know, break down in your body, if it's got what it says it has in it, all those types of things. So it's a really good resource. So that's it for what I wanted to make sure to talk about. How do you want to go about the questions?
Wow, all I can say is, wow, Greta, thank you so much. This has been terrific. And I know, because people are writing, sending me notes on the chat, that they're really grateful. I want to tell you all that Greta is just being too modest about her own recipes. The one thing I love about Greta's recipes is that she writes them for people that don't have to be a cordon bleu chef.
Well, because I'm not one, so yeah.
They are easy recipes. You'll find them. We've linked them on our webpage. You'll find them, I think, also through cancer.edu CRC. But they're great recipes. They're simple recipes, and they're the sort of recipes you think to yourself, boy, why didn't I think about putting these things together? They look delicious, and they're great. So the Cancer Fighting Kitchen, I've met Rebecca Capps a couple of times. It's a great book. Let's get rid of so there's a lot of good resources there. Greta, we have received a few questions during. I've tried to put them in the chat window to you directly. That way they're highlighted to you, so you can see some of the information has already been covered. I'm
not sure how to see those. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. I wonder if I can. Okay.
You see where the chat is? You can click on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Shaded, and those ones that are shaded are ones that are coming in directly to you.
Okay. So I can. Want me just to go down the list?
I think what I'd like to do first, and then maybe we can just go down that list and the other questions you've had, if you feel you haven't covered anything, is
okay. Sure.
Bill, do you want to unmute yourself at this point, if you're still with us?
Yep, I'm still here.
I'd like to introduce Professor Bill Burhans, who is a cancer research scientist at Roswell Park. And for those of you who are on our advanced cancer virtual calls, you'll know Bill well. And for many, many years, Bill has been looking at the impact of glucose and sugars and insulins on cancer. That's really been probably his main field of study, as well, many other fields as well, but that's been a real interest of his. And we've had the privilege of hearing Bill talk about some of these low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets. And Bill, what I'd like to do is maybe ask you to talk to Greta a little bit, to see if we can just explain to some of the people online who have heard these terms, what exactly they mean and how important they are for people with cancer. I mean, maybe they're more important for people with more advanced cancer or less advanced cancer. We know that there are some people who have been recommended to eat less or even to fast before they go on chemotherapy. I'll let you and Greta just discuss this a little bit between yourselves for 5 minutes, and hopefully that'll benefit all of us.
Okay, so do you want to do this before Greta goes through the questions?
Yes. Why don't we do it now? You can talk a little bit and give Greta some breathing room so she can look at the questions whilst listening to you.
Okay, so Greta, my research involves looking at the effects of, hold on one sec, please.
Sure. I think Bill's probably moving to a different room, I guess.
No, I'm back.
Okay, go ahead.
So my research involves, among many other things, looking at the effects of elevated levels of glucose on things like reactive oxygen species generation in cells. And in a nutshell, what we found is that glucose, or foods that are broken down into glucose, the glucose that results from that breakdown process can act as basically as a growth factor in pushing cells through the cell cycle, just as oncogenes do that, are most people are aware of, at least in the scientific world, as a cause for cancer. And so from that point of view, I've been telling patients that I encounter that it's a good idea to reduce their consumption of carbohydrates that get broken down into glucose. But in the past, we've, on several of these calls, some of the patients that have participated have raised questions about ketogenic diets. And by that, I think we mean diets that are higher in fat. And obviously, by that, we would mean the fats that you described that are better for us than than animal fats, for example. But I think the idea is that cancer cells have this predilection for burning glucose, and a higher fat diet will push them into a mode of metabolism where they're not as dependent on glucose, and they're generating more reactive oxygen species, and that makes them more sensitive to to chemotherapeutic agents and radiation and things like that. So I'm just, as I emailed you earlier today, when the question first arose about whether or not the ketogenic diets, and especially ketogenic supplements, were a wise choice for prostate cancer patients like us, my initial what I said initially was that I thought it was all snake oil, but then I looked into it, and there are in fact a lot of preclinical studies, not very many that have been done in patients, but many that have been done in mice, for example, which show that ketogenic diets or diet supplementation with ketogenic supplements do have a benefit. So I'm wondering what your thinking is on this, both in terms of ketogenic diets and the supplements, ketogenic supplements to diets.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for all the background. That's helpful. I think that, the research with a ketogenic diet is kind of in the building phase, and I think it's really interesting. I think that if you're looking at the preclinical models, there's definitely seems to be a lot of, good ideas there from what I've seen, and it sounds like you know way more about it than I do. My concern is that a lot of people don't really know what a ketogenic diet is. And so it is a high-fat diet, but it is also a calorie-controlled and not just a carbohydrate-restricted, but also a protein-restricted diet. And so people, can't just put themselves on a ketogenic diet without doing a lot of research and kind of looking at how the diet might affect their whole body processes and things like that. So I would just recommend that if, I've had patients with prostate cancer that have gone on ketogenic diets, and my advice to them is to be smart about it and to make sure that you're consulting with a nutritionist or dietitian that's very knowledgeable in what an actual ketogenic diet is, because to get the benefits, it's not just about restricting carbohydrates, but also there's some effect of the ketones themselves. And so sometimes people can't actually get into ketosis just by eating a high-fat diet and restricting carbohydrates. So I think it's important to have it really planned out and look at all the, potential positives and negatives to it, is what I would say. And I'd say, to me, it seems too early to say what the effects are going to be. I think it looks promising, and I'm really excited to see more research as it comes forward. So that's kind of what I see. I think there's a lot of research in the area of brain tumors. That is where a lot of the research is focused, because of the way brain, tumor cells use nutrients versus a lot of the other types of cells. So I'm really following the research on that. The supplements, I haven't really seen much in the way of studies with the supplements, like the beta hydroxybutyrate and some of those supplements that are like the key. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, and like MCT oil and such like that. It seems to me, from what I have seen, that potentially they could help somebody get into ketosis with a less restrictive diet. But I haven't actually seen much in the way of human studies to support that.
Okay, yeah, so I agree with you completely. Except that it is the case, I think, that you'd really have to restrict your intake of carbohydrates really severely, or raise the amount of fat in your diet to an extreme level.
Well, you do.
Ketoacidosis.
But I've also had patients that have restricted their the amount of carbohydrates, just so people in the audience can understand what an actual ketogenic diet is, typically you're eating no more than about 15 grams of carbohydrates a day, and a cup and a half of broccoli has 15 grams of carbohydrates. So really there's no fruit, there's no grains, there's no dairy, there's no beans. You can eat some vegetables, and that's kind of it. And then the rest is fat. So there's things like cream and butter. You can focus on plant-based fats, but protein also has to be restricted. So a lot of, like, say a man needs 2,000 calories, even his protein would be down to, say, 40 grams or so a day, which is the equivalent of about, 5 ounces of meat for the whole day. And again, none of those plant-based proteins really, because if you eat too much protein, you can turn that into glucose as well. And so the more glucose in the bloodstream, the less the liver is going to have to start making these ketones.
And
right.
What I'd like to just add for those of you listening is this is a very specific diet I think we're talking about around certain treatments like chemotherapy. I'm not sure that this ketogenic diet is the sort of diet that you would be wanting to do 24/7, or am I wrong on that?
Well, I think there are a lot of proponents of following this diet on a regular basis, not just the limited dietary changes that would accompany chemotherapy treatment that Walter Longo, our friend at USC, for example, is talking about. But I think that, one of the important things that I learned tonight from Greta is that I think it would be very hard to follow a ketogenic diet without getting into trouble because of the types of fats that you would need to consume. And you have to, there are so many that you would have to stay away from because they would counterbalance any benefit you would get from the effects on ketones. For example, that I think it would be really difficult. As far as the ketogenic supplements, I don't know enough about those, and I think, Greta, you're right. There just haven't been very many studies about them to really know whether or not they're beneficial. I think I would, now that I have listened to your presentation, I think my advice to the other patients on these calls would be that they are potentially beneficial, but you really need to be careful, and you need to consult not just with a physician, perhaps instead of with a physician, but with a nutritionist who's going to better know the answers to these questions.
That's great.
as far as the chemotherapy, the effects on chemotherapy, that's a little bit different, Rick. And there I'm, this is something that Walter and I have published on together, and the risks involved in going on a low-calorie diet for a short period of time before chemotherapy are minimal because it's for a short period of time. And I think that the animal studies and now, the first results coming in from clinical studies clearly indicate that for complicated reasons that I won't try to explain, this can act synergistically with chemotherapeutic agents to improve their efficacy. But again, it's something that anyone that was thinking of doing this would need to talk to their doctors about. And, it really hasn't been explored in clinical trials yet to the extent where I think that anybody should be doing this, without the proper guidance.
But for the couple of guys that I know that are listening in who are contemplating chemotherapy in the very near future, I would recommend you raise this fasting diet with your doctor and discuss it with him. And we can send you some more information if you need to educate your doctor, but it's something that's certainly worth some consideration. Greta, are there any questions in your mind that that we haven't covered that you'd like to answer?
There was one question here that somebody asked about their calcium intake. Their oncologist had them on calcium and vitamin D supplementation since being diagnosed with osteopenia, and how much is too much, and can references be supplied for these statements. So what I recommend is for that situation is for men to achieve about 1,200 milligrams of calcium a day through a combination of diet and then supplement with what's needed that you're not getting from diet, but not just from supplementation. So 1,200 milligrams is what I recommend for calcium. I would be concerned with getting over 1,500 milligrams, more because of the risk of high calcium intakes and increased risk of prostate cancer, not necessarily because I have concrete evidence of progression, but I just feel like if it increases the risk, at a cellular level, maybe it's promoting cancers. And really with calcium, more is not necessarily better. So I think if you're getting 1,200 milligrams, then you're adequately supporting your bone health and really making sure that your vitamin D level is adequate and that you're also exercising and doing weight-bearing exercise. So the other thing I would say about calcium is that when you do supplement, it's good to take it in the way that is like as if you would eat it. So we can only absorb about 500 milligrams of calcium at once. So if you are somebody that gets no calcium from your diet and you are taking more than, close to 1,200 through supplementation or close to 1,000 through supplementation, it's recommended to space that out throughout the day where you're getting like 400 to 500 milligrams at most at one time and then having the rest at another meal. So that way you can optimize your absorption and utilization. So as far as do I have references for that? Well, on one of the links that Rick gave, we have our old nutrition and prostate cancer document that says Your Health Matters. It's a UCSF document that we're updating, and we do have a whole few pages on calcium, and they're all set reference to journals. So that's where I would go for those references.
And Greg, there's a question a gentleman just posted in the bottom of the chat box, which is very, very similar, where he's suffering from kidney stones, which I personally am also quite familiar with. And so his doc has said, well, stay off a lot of the vegetables that are high in calcium, stay away from spinach, stay away from broccoli. He's basically asking what can he eat?
Well, usually with kidney stones, we don't recommend taking calcium supplements. We actually recommend getting more calcium from food. And then the reason that his doctor probably recommended avoiding like the spinach is because it's high in something called oxalates. And oxalates can bind and increase calcium stones or kidney stones that are calcium based. And so those are typically in like green leafy vegetables. So I don't think you should avoid calcium rich foods, but just avoid calcium supplements. And then go onto the internet and get a list of high oxalate foods and limit those because those can increase the risk of kidney stones.
And I would just add to the same gentleman that Greta covered eggs and chicken pretty well. So if you came in a little late, we are definitely going to be posting this whole presentation. I actually am going straight from here to the airport. I have a flight at 5:40 a.m. in the morning, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get it uploaded today. It may take me 24 to 48 hours before I find myself in a place where I'm there long enough with good enough internet connection to do it, but it will definitely get posted. Well, Greta, I don't want to, you've been amazing, and we are so grateful. I mean, I knew it was going to be good. Now, we probably had over 100 people listening in, well over 100 people listening in. Now they all know how good it was. And it was just terrific. We can't thank you enough. We absolutely.
It's my pleasure. I was looking forward to this for 6 months.
Yeah, Greta, this is Bill Burhans. It was very, very good, very informative, and I'm really grateful as well.
Oh, thank you. It was nice talking to you.
So, I think at this point we can close out. If anybody feels that we've missed anything in particular, reach out to me and I'll convey it to Greta and we'll try and get you an answer. But I just want to go back to one thing that Greta said, which is if you're going to make significant changes in your diet, try and keep your medical team posted. It's really important. Because there are interactions. Don't just think, oh, it's a good idea to eat more tomatoes. It's a good idea to eat more of this. It's a good idea to eat more of that. It may well be. But it's an even better idea to keep your medical team on what you're doing. And hopefully you'll all eat healthier. You'll all exercise more. And you'll all live longer as a result of spending an hour and a half with us tonight. So
live well longer.
Well,
quality. Good quality of life, not just quantity.
Right. The other thing you should know, by the way, is Greta and I share a birthday.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah.
So we're kindred spirits.
Yeah.
Okay. So
all
good
right,
night, everybody, and thank you for listening in.
Bye. Take care, Rick, and everybody else. Bye.
Bye-bye.